He didn't ask twice. He just saw it. And somehow that was worse. The makeup cracked the second I bent my wrist, a thin line of pale skin breaking through layers that were supposed to hide everything. And I knew before I even looked up that tonight wasn't going to be like the others, because the man in the corner, the one every manager suddenly cared about, the one who didn't laugh, didn't drink much, didn't look at anyone unless he meant to, was already watching me, and not the way men usually did. Not careless, not curious, but precise, like he was reading something written under my skin, and I tried to ignore it. I really did, because I had 6 tables, a tray full of glasses, and 17 missed calls from Tyler sitting heavy in my apron pocket like a countdown. I couldn't stop, but my hands wouldn't steady, my breath wouldn't slow, and every time the kitchen door swung open, I flinched like someone was about to call my name and tell me it was time to go home, time to face whatever mood he'd decided to be in tonight. And I told myself, just get through the shift, just keep moving, don't drop anything, don't draw attention, don't let anyone see. But then it happened anyway, because of course it did, because it always does. One wrong step, one edge of a glass catching the tray, and suddenly everything tilted, the world narrowing to that split second where you know you're about to mess up, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Except this time I didn't fall, I didn't drop anything, because a hand caught my arm, firm but controlled, steadying me like I weighed nothing at all, and I froze, not from the near accident, but from the contact itself, from how different it felt, how it didn't squeeze, didn't hurt, just held. And in that moment my sleeve slid back, just enough, just for a second, and I knew he saw it, the bruising beneath the makeup, the shape I'd spent 20 minutes trying to blur into something meaningless, and I pulled back too fast, heart slamming, trying to fix it, to cover it, to pretend it hadn't happened. But it was too late, because his eyes had already changed, darkening in a way that made the air around us feel heavier, quieter, like the whole restaurant had stepped back without realizing it. And when he spoke, his voice was low, calm, controlled in a way that somehow made it impossible to ignore. Who did that to you? And I did what I always do, what I've trained myself to do. I smiled, small, polite, nothing real behind it. And I said the first lie that came to mind, something about a door, something about being clumsy, something easy, something safe. But he didn't look convinced, didn't nod, didn't play along. He just held my gaze for a second too long, like he could see every version of that lie and none of them mattered. And then he let go, just like that, like it was his choice to release me, not mine to pull away. And I should have walked off, should have forgotten it. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way he said nothing after, the way he didn't push, didn't embarrass me, didn't expose me in front of anyone, just reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, and set it down on the edge of my tray with the same deliberate calm. Call me before it gets worse. And I didn't respond, couldn't, because something in my chest tightened at the idea that he thought it would, that it already had. And maybe the worst part was that he was right. But I nodded anyway, like it meant nothing, like I'd never use it, like I still had control over anything in my life. And I walked away, back into the noise, back into the orders and the lights and the fake smiles. But everything felt different. Now, sharper, louder, like I couldn't hide as well as I thought. Like someone had finally noticed the cracks, and now I couldn't unfeel that, couldn't go back to being invisible. And the rest of the shift blurred, plates and voices and numbers I barely registered, until finally, it ended, and I stepped outside into the cool night air, rain just starting to fall, soft at first, then heavier, soaking through my thin jacket in seconds. And I should have felt relief, should have felt safe, leaving that place, but instead my stomach twisted, because my phone buzzed again, his name lighting up the screen, and I just knew, that going home wasn't going to be quiet tonight. And I thought about the card in my pocket, about the way that man had looked at me like he already understood everything I was trying to hide. And for a second, just 1 second, I wondered what would happen if I actually called. But I didn't, I couldn't, because that would mean admitting I needed help, and I wasn't ready to do that yet, not when I could still pretend I had a choice. So I tucked the phone away, pulled my jacket tighter, and stepped into the rain, not knowing that someone else was already watching, already deciding, and that by the time this night was over, nothing in my life was going to look the same again. I should have called him. That was the first thought that hit me when I saw Tyler leaning against the brick wall across the street. his silhouette cut sharp under the flickering streetlight, like he had been there long enough to memorize every step I would take the moment I walked out. And my feet slowed without permission, my body already calculating the distance, the exits, the way the rain slicked the pavement and made everything harder to run on. But it did not matter because he had already seen me, his head lifting, his posture shifting, and that familiar tension wrapped around my chest before he even said my name. Hannah, drawn out like it belonged to him, like I belonged to him. And I told myself, stay calm. Keep your voice steady. Do not escalate. Just get through this like every other night. But my hands were shaking anyway, and I hated that he could always tell, hated that it gave him something, some kind of control I could not take back. You did not answer your phone, he said, stepping closer, not fast, not aggressive, just enough to close the space in a way that made it feel like there was nowhere else to go. And I swallowed, forcing a small smile that did not reach my eyes. I was working, Tyler, you know that. And for a second, just a second, I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe tonight would be one of the easier ones. But then his gaze dropped to my apron, to the outline of my phone still tucked inside. And something in his expression tightened, not loud, not explosive, just cold, controlled in a way that felt worse. You always have time, he said quietly, and I felt the words more than heard them, like a pressure building in the air between us, and I stepped back, instinctively, creating space that did not really exist. Can we just go home? I said, keeping my voice low, because the last thing I needed was attention. The last thing I needed was anyone from the restaurant stepping outside and seeing this, seeing me like this. And for a moment he did not move, just looked at me, searching for something, maybe an apology, maybe an admission, maybe something I did not even understand anymore. And then his hand reached out, catching my wrist, not rough at first, just firm, but my body reacted anyway. A sharp intake of breath, a flinch I could not stop, and I saw it the second it happened. The way his eyes narrowed, the way he noticed. Why are you acting like that? He asked, and I shook my head too quickly. I am not. I am just tired. But he did not let go, his grip tightening just enough to remind me he could, just enough to make my pulse spike. And the rain picked up around us, cold against my skin, soaking through the thin fabric of my shirt. And suddenly everything felt too close, too loud, too much. You smell like that place, he muttered, like it was an accusation, like I had done something wrong by just being there, by working, by existing outside of him. And I opened my mouth to respond, to say something that would calm him down, something that would end this before it got worse. But the words caught in my throat, because I could feel it shifting, the moment where everything tipped, where logic stopped matching. And then it happened, subtle, almost quiet, his other hand brushing my sleeve, pushing it back just enough to reveal what I had tried so hard to hide. And the silence that followed was heavier than anything he could have said. What is that? He asked, softer now, but not better, never better, and I pulled back, instinctively, trying to cover it. Nothing. I told you. I hid it earlier. But he was already shaking his head, already dismissing the lie, already stepping closer again, and my heart started to race. In a way that felt dangerous, like I was losing control of the situation, like I had already lost it. You think I am stupid, he said, not yelling. Not yet. But the words carried weight, and I shook my head again, faster this time. No, I just do not want to do this out here. And I meant it. I really did. I just wanted to get inside, to close the door, to contain it, to make it smaller somehow. But he did not move, did not release me. And the rain kept falling, harder now, dripping from his hair, from mine, pooling at our feet. And for a second, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. And then he pulled, not violently, but enough to make me stumble forward, enough to remind me that he could decide where I went. And that was when I saw it. Not him, not yet, just the shadow shifting at the edge of my vision, the sense of something else in the space, something I had not accounted for. And my breath caught, because I knew that feeling. I recognized it from earlier, from inside the restaurant, from the way the air had changed when he looked at me. And before I could turn, before I could fully understand what was happening, a voice cut through the rain, calm, steady, impossible to ignore. You should let her go. And everything stopped. Tyler's grip, my breath, the sound of the rain itself seemed to fade for a second, and slowly, Like he was not sure he wanted to. Tyler turned, his hand still wrapped around my wrist, his posture shifting from possession to something else, something more uncertain, and I followed his gaze, my heart pounding, because I already knew who it was, even before I saw him clearly under the streetlight, standing there like he had always been there, like he had never left, like this moment had been waiting for him all along. Dominic Russo. And he was not looking at Tyler. Not really. His eyes were on me, steady, assessing, the same way they had been before, but now there was something else there, something colder, something decided, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not harsher, just final. I said, "Let her go." And I felt the shift in Tyler's grip, the hesitation, the split second where control slipped, and for the first time that night, I realized this was no longer something I had to handle alone, and that realization scared me almost as much as it relieved me. Tyler did not let go immediately, and that pause, that hesitation, stretched longer than it should have, like he was deciding whether to push back or pretend he still had control, and I could feel his grip tightening and loosening at the same time, uncertainty threading through it, something I had never felt from him before, and that alone made my pulse spike in a different way, because Tyler was many things, but uncertain was not one of them. "Who are you supposed to be?" he said finally, his voice sharper now, defensive, but not as steady as before, and Dominic did not answer right away, did not step forward, did not raise his voice. He just stood there in the rain like he belonged to it, like the cold did not touch him, like none of this was new to him. And when he finally spoke, it was quiet enough that I had to focus to hear it. Someone who does not like seeing people treated like they do not have a choice. And the words landed heavier than anything loud could have, because they were not just for Tyler, they were for me, and I felt them settle somewhere deep, somewhere I had been trying not to look at for a long time. And Tyler laughed, short, sharp, forced. "This is none of your business," he said, and I could hear the edge creeping in, the need to reclaim something slipping through his fingers. And for a second I wanted to agree, wanted to tell Dominic to leave, to let me handle it the way I always did, quietly, contained, survivable, but the truth was already there, already exposed, and Dominic's gaze did not shift, not from me, not even when Tyler spoke, like he had already decided who mattered in this moment. "It became my business the second she flinched," he said, and my breath caught, because I had not even realized how obvious it had been, how much I had given away without meaning to, and Tyler's grip faltered again, just enough, just long enough for me to feel the difference. And Dominic took one step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate, like every movement had a purpose, and the space between all of us changed again, tightened, focused. "Let her go," he repeated, and this time it was not a suggestion, it was a line drawn somewhere I could not see but could feel, and Tyler hesitated, his hand still around my wrist, but no longer certain, no longer claiming, and then, slowly, like he did not want to admit it, he released me. And the absence of that pressure felt almost unreal, like my arm did not know what to do without it, like my body was waiting for it to come back, and I stepped back immediately, putting space between us, my heart still racing, my breath uneven, and for a second no one moved, no one spoke, just the rain falling around us, filling the silence with something softer than what had been there before. And then Tyler shook his head, like he was trying to reset the moment, to pull it back into something he understood. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do?" he said, but the words did not carry the same weight. Not anymore. Not with Dominic standing there. Not with the way everything had shifted, and Dominic finally looked at him, really looked at him, and it was not anger, not even irritation, it was assessment, quick and precise, like he was measuring something, deciding something, and whatever conclusion he reached, it settled in his posture, in the way his shoulders squared just slightly, in the way his voice came out even more controlled than before. "I think you are done here," he said, and it was not a threat, not something dramatic, just a statement, simple and final, and Tyler opened his mouth like he was going to argue, like he was going to push back, but then he stopped, something flickering across his face, something I could not quite name, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked unsure, and that was the moment everything changed, not because of what Dominic did, but because of what he did not have to do. Because Tyler took a step back, then another, his gaze shifting between the two of us, calculating, retreating, and then he turned, just like that, stepping away into the rain, not running, not rushed, but leaving. And I stood there, watching him go, my body still tense, still waiting for him to come back, for the moment to snap back into something familiar. But it did not. The street stayed quiet, the space stayed open, and when I finally looked back at Dominic, he was already watching me again, that same steady gaze, but softer now, not as sharp, not as cold, like something had eased now that the tension had broken. And I did not know what to say, did not know how to process what had just happened, because this was not how things usually went. This was not how it ended, and he must have seen that confusion, that uncertainty, because his voice when he spoke was different, quieter, almost careful. Are you okay? And the question felt strange, unfamiliar in a way that made my throat tighten, because no one had asked me that in a long time and actually meant it, and I nodded automatically, because that is what I always did, that is what I had learned to do. But he did not look convinced, not even a little, and for a second I thought he was going to press, to ask more, to dig into something I was not ready to explain. But he did not. He just reached into his jacket again, pulling out something small, something folded, and handed it to me, not forcing it, just offering it. You should not have to handle this alone, he said, and I looked down at it, at the card I had already been carrying in my pocket, and realized this one was different, a number written by hand, darker ink, more deliberate, and when I looked back up, his expression had not changed, still calm, still certain. That one reaches me directly, he added, and my heart skipped, not from fear this time, but from something else I could not quite place, something unfamiliar and dangerous in its own way, and I closed my fingers around the card, feeling the weight of it, the possibility of it, and for the first time that night, I did not feel completely trapped, but I also did not feel safe, not entirely, because, standing there in the rain with him, I realized something I had not understood before, that being seen, truly seen, might change everything, and I was not sure if I was ready for that. I stood there longer than I should have, the rain soaking through everything, my hair clinging to my face, my shirt heavy against my skin, but I could not seem to move, not yet, not after everything had just shifted so suddenly, so quietly, and Dominic did not rush me, did not step closer, did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. He just stayed where he was, giving me space I was not used to having, and somehow that felt more disarming than anything else. You should go somewhere warm, he said finally, his voice low, steady, like he was stating something obvious, something practical, and I nodded even though my feet did not follow right away, because leaving meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying everything that had just happened, the way Tyler had let go, the way he had walked away, the way Dominic had stepped in without raising his voice, without making a scene, and I realized I had never seen power look like that before, not loud, not chaotic, just controlled, and that thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, because if someone like him could change everything that easily, then what did that mean for me, for the fragile balance I had been holding onto for months, and I finally forced myself to move, taking a step back, then another, creating distance between us even though part of me felt strangely anchored by his presence. Thank you, I said, the words coming out quieter than I intended, because I did not know what else to say, did not know how to acknowledge something I had not asked for but had clearly needed, and he gave a small nod, not dismissive, not overly familiar, just accepting it for what it was. You do not owe me anything, he replied, and that should have made it easier, should have made it simple, but it did not, because nothing about this felt simple anymore, and I glanced down at the card still in my hand, the ink slightly smudged from the rain, and for a second I wondered if I should give it back, if I should pretend this had been a one-time thing, a moment that would not follow me beyond this street, but my fingers tightened around it instead, holding on to it in a way that felt instinctive. Like I already understood it might matter more than I wanted it to. He will not come back tonight, Dominic added, and something in the way he said it made me believe him without question, made me realize he was not guessing, not hoping, he knew, and that certainty settled into my chest in a way that felt unfamiliar, like relief mixed with something sharper, something that made me cautious, because certainty like that did not come without a cost, and I looked up at him again, studying his face, in the dim light, trying to understand what kind of man stood in front of me, what kind of world he came from, and whether stepping into it, even slightly, was something I could survive. How do you know that? I asked before I could stop myself, and he held my gaze for a second, considering, measuring how much to say, and then he answered simply, because I do not make promises I cannot keep. And that should not have been reassuring, it should have been a warning, but instead it settled. Something restless inside me, something that had been waiting for stability, for someone to say something and mean it. And I hated how much that affected me, hated how quickly my guard shifted in response to it. And I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him, trying to pull back, trying to remind myself that this was still dangerous, still unknown, still not something I could trust just because it felt different. And I took another step back, turning slightly toward the street, toward the direction I needed to go, because staying here any longer felt like crossing a line I did not fully understand. I should go, I said, and this time my voice was steadier, more certain, and he nodded again, not stopping me, not offering to follow, not inserting himself further into the moment. And that restraint, that choice to let me leave on my own terms, lingered more than anything else he had done, and I started walking. The rain softening as I moved down the block, the city sounds slowly returning, cars passing, distant voices, the familiar noise of a world that had not changed even though mine had. And I could feel his presence behind me even after I could no longer see him, like the memory of it was enough to keep my shoulders tense, my thoughts racing. And when I finally reached the corner, I paused, just for a second, looking down at the card again, at the number written in darker ink, more deliberate, more personal, and I slipped it into my pocket carefully, separate from the other one, like I already knew it mattered differently. And the walk home felt longer than usual, every step echoing with the question I could not quite answer, what happens now? Because Tyler leaving like that was not normal, not something that fit into the pattern I understood, and the absence of that tension, that constant pressure, left a space I did not know how to fill. And by the time I reached my apartment building, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement in soft gold streaks, and everything looked almost peaceful, almost normal, but my chest still felt tight, my thoughts still unsettled, and I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle, because going inside meant facing whatever came next, alone, without the distraction of work or the presence of someone else shifting the balance. And I pushed the door open anyway, stepping into the quiet hallway, the hum of the old lights above me familiar and grounding. And for a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe tonight was different, that maybe things had shifted in a way that would give me space to breathe. But as I reached my apartment door, something fell off, something small but enough to stop me. And I looked down, my heart starting to beat faster again, because there, just beneath the door, was a thin envelope I did not recognize, the paper slightly damp from where it had been pushed through from the outside, and I knew, without opening it, without even touching it, that whatever had changed tonight was not finished yet, not even close. I did not touch the envelope right away, because something about it felt intentional, too deliberate to be random, like it had been placed there with a purpose that I was not ready to understand, and my hand hovered just above it for a second longer than necessary, my breath slowing, my senses sharpening in that quiet hallway where every small sound seemed louder than it should be. And I told myself it could be anything, maybe a notice from the landlord, maybe something misplaced, something ordinary, but nothing about tonight had been ordinary, and deep down I already knew that, so I crouched slowly, picking it up with careful fingers, the paper slightly damp, the edges softened by the rain that had seeped under the door, and I turned it over once, twice, looking for a name, a mark, anything that might explain why it was here, but there was nothing, just my apartment number, written in clean, precise handwriting, and that made my chest tighten, because it was not rushed, not careless. Whoever had left this had taken their time, had made sure it would be seen, and I stood back up, unlocking the door with a steadier hand than I felt, stepping inside and closing it behind me before opening the envelope, because whatever was inside, I wanted it contained. I wanted walls around me when I saw it, and the apartment greeted me with the same quiet it always did, small, worn, familiar in a way that usually grounded me. But tonight it felt different, like even this space had shifted, like something had followed me home, and I slid the envelope open carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper, my fingers brushing over the surface as I unfolded it. And the first thing I noticed was how simple it was. No logo, no decoration, just a few lines typed neatly in the center, and I read it once. Then again, because my mind needed a second to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. You were not supposed to be there tonight. Be careful who notices you. And that was it. No signature, no explanation, just those words hanging in the air like a warning that had arrived too late. And I felt something cold settle in my stomach, something sharper than fear, something that felt like realization. Because this was not about Tyler. Not really. This was about something else, something bigger that I had stepped into without understanding it. And my mind went back to the restaurant, to the VIP section, to the way Dominic had been watching, to the way the atmosphere had shifted when he entered, and I realized that whatever world he came from, it was not separate from mine anymore, not after tonight, and I folded the paper slowly, my movements automatic, controlled, like if I moved too fast it would make it more real, and I set it down on the small kitchen counter, staring at it like it might change if I looked long enough. But it did not. It stayed exactly the same, a quiet reminder that something had already begun, and I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my damp hair, trying to think, trying to piece together what this meant, because the message was clear in its own way. I had been seen, not just by Dominic, not just by Tyler, but by someone else, someone who did not want me involved, someone who had already taken the time to reach me, to warn me, and that thought made my chest tighten again. Because warnings like that did not come without reason, and I stepped back from the counter, pacing once across the small space, then again, my mind racing through possibilities I could not fully grasp, and then my phone buzzed in my pocket, sudden and sharp in the quiet room, making me jump more than it should have, and I pulled it out quickly, my heart still unsteady, and the screen lit up with a number I did not recognize at first, just a string of digits, unfamiliar, but something about it felt connected, like it belonged to everything that had happened tonight, and I stared at it for a second, debating whether to answer, whether to let it ring, whether ignoring it would somehow make things simpler. But nothing about this was simple anymore, and I swiped to accept the call before I could overthink it, lifting the phone to my ear without speaking. And for a moment there was only silence, the faint sound of breathing on the other end, controlled, measured, and then his voice came through, low, steady, unmistakable. You got home safely. And I closed my eyes briefly, because of course he knew, of course he would know, and I leaned back against the counter, grounding myself in the cool surface behind me. Yes, I said, my voice quieter than I intended, and there was a pause. Not awkward, not uncertain, just space, like he was giving me time to say more if I wanted to, and I did not yet, because there was too much I did not understand, too much I was not ready to put into words. And he did not push, did not fill the silence, just waited. And then he spoke again, softer this time, but no less certain. Something else happened, and it was not a question, it was a statement, and my grip on the phone tightened slightly, because I knew exactly what he meant, and I glanced back at the paper on the counter, at the words that had shifted everything again, and I felt that same unfamiliar tension rise in my chest, the mix of fear and something else I could not quite name. Because part of me wanted to deny it, to keep this separate, to not let him into this part of it. But another part of me, the part that had kept the card, that had not thrown it away, knew that it was already too late for that. And I swallowed, steadying my voice before I spoke. There was an envelope, I said, and the silence on the other end changed, subtle but immediate, like the weight of the conversation had shifted, and when he spoke again, his tone was sharper, more focused. What did it say? And I hesitated, just for a second, because repeating it out loud would make it real in a different way, but I did it anyway, reading the words exactly as they were written, and when I finished, there was no immediate response, just that same controlled silence, and I could almost picture him processing it, fitting it into something larger that I could not yet see, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. Do not ignore that, he said. And something in the way he said it made my pulse quicken again, because it was not fear he was conveying. It was certainty, the same certainty he had shown earlier, the same quiet authority that made me listen even when I did not fully understand why. I was not planning to. I replied, and that was the truth, because ignoring it did not feel like an option anymore. And there was another pause, shorter this time, before he spoke again. I am sending someone to you. And the words hit me. Faster than I expected, and I straightened slightly, my grip tightening on the phone. No, I said instinctively, the response immediate, because the idea of someone else showing up, of more of his world stepping into mine, felt like crossing a line I had not agreed to. And he did not argue, did not push back. But when he responded, his tone did not change, still calm, still certain. You can say no, but I am still going to make sure you are safe. And the quiet finality of that settled into the space between us. And for the first time since I had met him, I realized something that made my breath catch. That this was not just about helping me, not just about stepping in for one moment and stepping back out. This was something else, something deeper, something that had already begun to wrap around my life whether I was ready for it or not. And as I stood there in my small apartment, staring at the warning on the counter and listening to the steady voice on the other end of the line, I understood that whatever had started tonight was not something I could simply walk away from. Not anymore. I did not argue again, because something in his voice told me it would not change anything. Not really. And the silence that followed stretched between us in a way that felt heavier than before, like we had crossed into a space where my choices mattered less than his decisions. And that realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. So I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against the edge of the counter to ground myself. I do not need someone watching my door, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to hold on to some piece of control. And on the other end of the line, he paused, not dismissing me, not interrupting, just listening in that same way he always did, like he weighed every word before responding. And when he spoke again, his tone was still calm, still measured, but there was something firmer beneath it, something that did not bend easily. You are not being watched, Hannah. You are being protected. And I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because the difference between those two things felt thinner than he made it sound. And I turned slightly, pacing once across the small space, my bare feet quiet against the worn floor, my mind trying to catch up with everything that had happened in the last hour. Those are not the same thing, I replied, softer now, because I was not trying to fight him. Not really. I was trying to understand where I stood in all of this. And there was a brief pause before he answered, just long enough to tell me he had considered that. There when you do not yet see the whole picture, he said. And the words settled into the room in a way that made my chest tighten. Because that was the second time tonight he had implied there was more going on then. I understood, more than I had seen, and I glanced again at the paper on the counter, at the warning that had already proven that point, and I felt that same unease rise in my stomach, because I did not like being part of something I could not define, something that moved around me without my permission, and I ran a hand through my hair again, pushing the damp strands back, trying to think clearly. Then tell me the picture, I said, the question coming out sharper than I intended, because if I was going to be pulled into this, I needed to know what it was, and for a moment, there was only silence on the other end, not empty, not disconnected, just deliberate, like he was deciding how much to give me. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more focused. You were in the wrong place at the right time tonight, he said, and I frowned slightly, because that sounded too simple, too vague for everything that had happened. And he continued before I could respond. The men at that table were not there for dinner, and my breath caught slightly, because I had felt that, sensed it without understanding, the way the atmosphere had shifted, the way their conversation had carried an edge beneath the surface, and I leaned back against the counter again, my mind replaying the night from the beginning, trying to connect what I had seen with what he was saying now. I did not hear anything. I said quickly, instinctively, because that felt important, like I needed to make it clear I was not involved in whatever it was he was hinting at. And he did not sound surprised, did not sound relieved, just certain. It does not matter what you heard, he replied. It matters that you were there, that you were seen. And the words echoed the message from the envelope in a way that made my grip on the phone tighten, because this was not coincidence, not something isolated. This was connected, all of it. And I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. So the note, I started, but he finished the thought for me. Was not about Tyler, he said, and I closed my eyes briefly, because I had already known that, deep down, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way that was harder to ignore, and the room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer, the air heavier, and I pushed myself upright again, moving away from the counter, from the paper, like distance could somehow give me clarity. Then why me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because I was not special, not important, not someone who should be noticed in any of this. And that was the part that did not make sense. And for the first time since the call began, there was a shift in his tone, something quieter, something that felt almost personal. Because you were not supposed to matter, he said, and I stilled. The words hitting something I had not expected, something that resonated in a way that was both unsettling and strangely familiar. And I let out a slow breath, trying to process that, trying to understand what it meant in the context of everything else. And then he continued, more direct now, but you did. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it suggested a change, a disruption, something that had altered the course of whatever had been planned. And I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him, because I did not know how to respond to that, did not know how to step into a role I had never chosen. And the silence stretched again, heavier this time, until he broke it. Someone will be outside your building in 5 minutes, he said, and my head snapped up slightly, my pulse jumping at the sudden shift back to action. I said I did not want that. I replied, but my voice lacked the edge it had before, because now there was too much I did not understand, too much I could not control. And he did not argue, did not justify, just stated it again, softer this time. You do not have to let them in, but they will be there. And that was the compromise, if it could even be called that. And I exhaled slowly, realizing that this was the line I had been pushed to, not complete surrender, but not full control either, something in between that felt unfamiliar and unstable. And I glanced toward the door, toward the thin barrier between me and whatever was waiting outside. And for the first time since I had walked into my apartment, I felt the weight of being alone in it, the vulnerability of it, the way the quiet could shift from comfort to something else entirely, and my fingers tightened around the phone again, grounding myself in the sound of his voice still present on the other end. Stay inside, he added, and there was something in that, something that felt less like an order and more like a request he expected me to follow, and I nodded. Before I realized he could not see it. I will, I said, and the words felt like a decision, small but significant, and there was a brief pause, softer this time, before he spoke again. I will call you in a few minutes, and I did not question it, did not push back, just accepted it, because somewhere between the restaurant and this moment, something had shifted, not just around me, but in me. And when the line went quiet, when the call ended, I stood there for a second longer, the phone still in my hand, listening to the silence that followed. And then, slowly, I turned toward the door, toward whatever was waiting on the other side, knowing that whatever came next, I was no longer standing outside of it, not anymore. I did not open the door right away, even after I heard the faint sound of a car engine idling outside, because everything in me was split between two instincts that did not agree with each other, one telling me to stay exactly where I was, to lock everything, to pretend none of this had followed me home, and the other reminding me of the envelope, of the words written too carefully to ignore, of the fact that someone already knew where I lived, and that staying still would not make that disappear. And I moved slowly instead, quiet steps across the apartment until I stood just to the side of the door, my breath shallow, my hand resting lightly against the wall as I listened, really listened, for anything out of place. But there was only the low hum of the building, the distant echo of footsteps from another floor, and the steady rhythm of rain easing into a soft drizzle outside. And then my phone buzzed again in my hand, the vibration, sharp enough to make my heart jump, and I looked down, already knowing who it would be before the screen even lit up, and I answered without hesitation this time, lifting it to my ear as I kept my eyes on the door. They are there, he said, not asking, just confirming, and I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the sound of his voice. I think so, I replied, because I had not looked yet, had not checked, and there was a brief pause before he spoke again. Do not open the door until you are sure, and I nodded instinctively, even though he could not see it, and I shifted slightly, leaning closer to the small peephole, hesitating for a second before I looked, because once I saw who was out there, it would make this real in a way I could not undo. But I looked anyway, pressing my eye to the glass, and the view was narrow, distorted, but clear enough to see the figure standing just outside the building entrance across the street, not at my door, not knocking, just there still, patient, like he had been told exactly where to stand and how long to wait. And something about that made my chest tighten, because it was not intrusive, not aggressive, it was controlled, intentional. And I stepped back slowly, my mind trying to process the difference between what I expected and what I was seeing. "He is not at my door," I said quietly, and on the other end, Dominic's voice remained steady. "He will not be unless you ask him to be." And that distinction settled into me in a way that shifted something small but important, because it meant I still had a choice, even if it was limited, even if it existed within boundaries I had not set. And I glanced back at the envelope on the counter, at the words that had brought all of this here, and I felt that same tension rise again, because ignoring it no longer felt like an option, not with someone already outside, not with Dominic on the other end of the line, not with everything that had already changed. And I moved away from the door, pacing once across the room before stopping again, my thoughts circling the same question: what happens if I let this in? And I realized I did not just mean opening the door, I meant all of it. The protection, the involvement, the shift in my life that I could already feel happening whether I was ready for it or not. And I pressed my fingers lightly against my temple, trying to slow my thoughts, trying to find something solid to hold on to. "What if this makes it worse?" I asked finally, the question quiet but real, because I needed to understand the risk, not just the safety. And there was a pause before he answered, not long, but enough to tell me. He was considering it, weighing how to respond. "It might," he said, and I froze slightly, because I had not expected that, not expected honesty that direct. And he continued, just as steady, "But ignoring it will not make it better." And the truth of that settled into me immediately, because I already knew it, had always known it in other parts of my life, and hearing it now, in this context, made it impossible to deny. And I let out a slow breath, my shoulders dropping slightly as the decision began to take shape, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And I turned back toward the door again, my steps more certain this time, more deliberate, and I stopped just before it, my hand hovering over the handle, feeling the weight of the moment in a way I had not expected. Because this was not just about opening a door, it was about stepping into something I could not fully see, something that had already started without my permission. And I closed my eyes for a brief second, steadying myself, before opening them again and speaking into the phone. "I'm going to talk to him." And there was no hesitation in his response, no attempt to stop me, just that same quiet control. "Keep the door between you," he said, and I nodded again, my grip tightening slightly on the handle. And then I turned it slowly, carefully, opening the door just enough to create a barrier, just enough to see the hallway beyond. And the air felt different immediately, cooler, quieter, like the space outside carried a different kind of tension. And I stepped just into the doorway, not crossing it, not inviting anything further. And after a moment, I saw him, the man Dominic had sent, moving into view from the far end of the hall, his posture straight, his expression neutral. And he stopped a few feet away, maintaining distance without being told. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about how this worked, about the rules I had not been taught, but was already expected to understand. And he gave a small nod, respectful, not intrusive. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice calm, professional. And I felt something shift again, something subtle but undeniable, because hearing my name like that, in this context, made it clear that I was no longer just someone passing through the edge of this world. I was already in it, and I swallowed, steadying myself as I met his gaze, aware of the phone still pressed to my ear, aware of Dominic still listening, still present even from a distance. And for the first time since this all began, I realized that the line between my life and his had already blurred. And standing there in the doorway, with the rain fading outside and the quiet of the hallway pressing in around us, I understood that whatever came next, there was no going back to before tonight. Not anymore. He did not move closer, and that was the first thing I noticed. Not his face, not his voice, but the distance he chose to keep, like he understood something about boundaries that no one had ever explained to me before. And it made the tension in my shoulders ease just slightly, not gone, not even close, but different, controlled. And I kept the door where it was, open just enough, my hand still resting on the edge like I might close it at any second if something felt wrong. And he seemed to understand that too, his posture steady, his gaze direct, but not invasive. My name is Victor, he said. Simple, clear, like names mattered here, like introductions were part of a structure I had not learned yet. And I nodded once, not offering mine because he already knew it, because that much had been made clear the moment he said it. And the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, just measured, like we were both waiting to see what the other would do next. And I became suddenly aware of the phone still at my ear, of Dominic listening on the other end, of how strange it felt to be standing between two worlds at once, one inside my apartment, quiet and familiar, and one just outside it, controlled, watchful, and I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself before speaking. You are the one he sent, I said, and Victor inclined his head just enough to confirm it. I am here to make sure you are not alone tonight, he replied, and there was no exaggeration in his tone, no attempt to make it sound softer or more comforting than it was, just a statement of purpose, and I felt that word settle in me, alone, because it had been true for so long that I had stopped questioning it, stopped expecting anything else, and now suddenly it was being challenged in a way that felt both relieving and unsettling at the same time. And I glanced briefly down the hallway behind him, empty except for the faint flicker of overhead lights, and then back at him, measuring, trying to understand what this would mean if I let it continue, if I did not shut the door right now and pretend none of this had followed me home. You are going to stand there all night? I asked, and there was the smallest hint of something in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite amusement, just acknowledgement. If that is what is required, he said, and something about that answer, about the willingness in it, shifted something small inside me, because it was not demanding, not forcing, it was offering, even if it did not feel like a choice at first, and I exhaled slowly, my fingers loosening slightly on the door, and I realized I was tired, not just from the shift, not just from the night, but from the constant effort of holding everything together on my own, of pretending I did not need help, of convincing myself that independence meant isolation, and I hated how quickly that thought came, how easily it made me consider something I would have refused hours ago, and I lifted the phone slightly, remembering he was still there, still listening. He is staying outside, I said quietly, and there was a brief pause before Dominic responded, his voice unchanged, steady as always, good, and that single word carried more meaning than it should have, because it told me this was expected, this was planned, this was not a reaction but a system, something that operated with or without my understanding of it. And I looked back at Victor again, at the way he held himself, at the way he had not stepped closer, had not tried to cross the threshold, and I felt the tension inside me shift again, not gone, but settling into something more manageable, something I could work with. And I stepped back just slightly, not enough to invite him in, but enough to create space. Enough to signal that I was not closing the door, not yet, and he did not move, did not take that as permission for anything more, just remained where he was, steady, patient, and I realized that this was the first time tonight I did not feel like I was reacting, like I was being pulled along without a choice, and that realization gave me something I had not had since I left the restaurant, a sense, however small, that I could decide how this went next, and I nodded once, more to myself than to him, before speaking again. If anything changes, you tell me first, I said, and it came out more like a condition than a request, something I needed to say out loud to feel like I still had some control, and he did not hesitate, did not question it, just answered, of course, and that immediate agreement, that lack of resistance, settled something deeper than I expected, because it meant I was not just being protected, I was being included, informed, treated like I had a role in this even if I did not fully understand it yet, and I stepped back another inch, just enough to ease the tension in my arm from holding the door, and the hallway air shifted slightly as the space between us changed, but still, he did not move forward, and I realized he would not unless I made it clear he could, and that realization stayed with me as I lifted the phone again, bringing it closer to my ear. I am going to keep the door open, I said, and there was a brief pause before Dominic responded, softer this time, but no less certain. That is your choice. And something in that, in the way he said it, made my chest tighten, because it was the first time he had framed anything like that as mine, and I held onto that, onto the idea that even within all of this, there were still decisions I could make, still lines I could draw, even if they were small, and I glanced once more at the envelope on the counter, at the warning that had started this part of the night, and then back at the man standing outside my door, and I understood something I had not been ready to admit before, that whatever had found me tonight was not going away, not quietly, not on its own, and standing there, with the door open. Just enough and the space between us carefully maintained. I realized that the question was no longer how to avoid it, but how to survive it, and that answer was already beginning to take shape in ways I could not yet fully see. The quiet did not feel empty anymore. It felt watched, not in a threatening way, not in the sharp edge that had followed me earlier, but in something steadier, something that stayed just outside the line I had drawn, and I realized as I stood there with the door still open that this was the first time in a long time that silence did not automatically mean I was alone, and that thought unsettled me more than I expected, because I had built my life around that assumption, around the idea that everything depended on me and me alone, and now that foundation felt like it had shifted without warning, and I turned slowly back into the apartment, leaving the door as it was, not fully open, not fully closed, a space between that matched exactly how I felt, caught between stepping forward and pulling back, and my eyes landed on the envelope again, still sitting on the counter where I had left it, its presence heavier now that I was no longer focused on the immediate moment, and I walked toward it, slower this time, more deliberate, like I was approaching something that might change if I looked at it long enough, and I picked it up again, unfolding the paper once more, reading the words carefully, tracing each letter like I might find something hidden between them, something I had missed the first time, but there was nothing new, just the same warning, the same quiet certainty that I had been noticed in a way I could not undo. And I exhaled slowly, setting it back down as my mind tried to make sense of what Dominic had said, about the men at the table, about being in the wrong place at the right time, about how it did not matter what I heard, only that I had been there, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I had actually paid attention, how focused I had been on getting through my shift, on keeping my head down, on not making mistakes, and yet somehow, that had not been enough. Somehow just being present had been enough to pull me into something I did not understand, and I pressed my fingers lightly against the counter, grounding myself as my thoughts began to spiral, because if being there was enough, then what else had I already done without realizing it? What else had I stepped into without seeing the edges? And my phone buzzed again, pulling me out of that loop before it could tighten further, and I glanced down, answering immediately. Because at this point, silence felt worse than whatever he had to say. "I am still here," Dominic said, and there was something different in his tone this time, not softer, not warmer, but more present, like he understood that this moment required something else, something steadier, and I leaned back against the counter, letting out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "So am I," I replied, and it sounded strange. Those words, like a confirmation I had never needed to give before, and there was a brief pause before he spoke again. "Tell me exactly where the envelope was," and the question shifted my focus immediately, pulling me out of uncertainty and into something more concrete, something I could answer, and I glanced toward the door, toward the narrow space beneath it, pushed under the door, I said, from the outside, and he did not respond right away, and I could almost feel him mapping it out, placing it in context, fitting it into whatever larger picture he had already started to build, and I watched the door without meaning to, my attention drawn back to that thin line of separation, to the idea that someone had stood there, just on the other side, close enough to reach through, close enough to leave something behind without being seen, and my chest tightened again at that thought, because it meant this had been personal, intentional, not random. And when Dominic spoke again, his voice was lower, more focused. "Did you hear anything before you came in?" he asked, and I shook my head automatically before answering. "No, nothing." And that made it worse somehow, the idea that it could have happened so quietly, so easily, without leaving any trace except the message itself, and I pushed away from the counter, pacing once across the room, my movements sharper now, more restless, because standing still made it feel too close, too immediate, and I stopped near the doorway again, glancing toward Victor, still in place, still steady, like time had not moved for him the way it had for me, and I felt a strange sense of reassurance in that, in the consistency of it, in the fact that at least one thing was exactly where it was supposed to be, and I turned slightly, speaking into the phone. Again, he is still there, and Dominic responded without hesitation, he will stay. And the certainty in that grounded me again, just enough to steady my thoughts, and I let out a slow breath, pressing my hand lightly against the doorframe, feeling the solidness of it beneath my fingers, something real, something I could rely on, and I realized that for the first time tonight, I was not just reacting, not just being pulled from one moment to the next. I was starting to understand the shape of what was happening, even if I could not see all of it yet, and that realization shifted something inside me, something small but important, because it meant I could adapt, I could learn, I could figure out how to exist within this new reality instead of being overwhelmed by it. And I looked down at the envelope one more time, then back toward the hallway, toward the man standing there, and then finally closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the pieces settle into place as much as they could, and when I opened them again, the fear was still there, the uncertainty still present, but underneath it, there was something else now, something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of control, and I understood in that moment that this was not just about surviving what had started tonight. It was about deciding how I was going to face it, and that decision, even in its smallest form, was mine to make. The moment I stopped pacing, the room felt too still again, like everything was waiting for me to make the next move, and that pressure settled in my chest in a way that made it hard to stay where I was. So I turned back toward the door, toward the narrow opening I had left between me and the hallway. And for a second, I just stood there, watching Victor, watching the way he had not shifted, not checked his phone, not glanced around, just remained present in a way that felt deliberate, like he understood that consistency itself was part of what he was here to provide. And I realized that the steadiness of it was starting to anchor me in ways I had not expected, not because I trusted him yet, not fully, but because he had not given me a reason not to, and that distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit, and I stepped closer to the door again, my hand brushing lightly against the edge as I leaned just slightly into the hallway, not crossing it, not inviting anything further, but closing the distance enough that my voice did not have to carry. "Has anyone come by?" I asked, and he shook his head once, a small, controlled movement. "No one," he replied, and there was no hesitation in his answer, no uncertainty, just clarity, and I nodded slowly, absorbing that, letting it settle into the larger picture that was still forming in my mind, and I became aware again of the phone still in my hand, of Dominic still on the other end, and I lifted it slightly, bringing it closer to my ear. "No one else has been here," I said, and there was a brief pause before he responded. "That does not mean they will not come." And the words were not meant to scare me. I could hear that in his tone. They were meant to prepare me, and that difference mattered, because it shifted the fear into something more manageable, something I could think through instead of just reacting to. And I glanced down at the envelope again, at the message that had started this part of the night, and I felt that same tension rise, but this time it did not spiral. It focused, narrowing into something sharper, something I could work with, and I walked back toward the counter, picking up the paper again, studying it more carefully this time, not just reading the words, but looking at how they were written, the spacing, the precision, the lack of anything extra, and I realized that whoever had left this had not been rushed, had not been careless. They had taken their time, and that meant something. It meant intention. It meant confidence, and that realization settled into me in a way that felt colder than before, because it suggested that this was not a one-time thing, not a random warning. This was part of something ongoing, something that had already included me whether I wanted it to or not. And I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the paper before I set it down again, forcing myself to step back, to create space between me and it, because staring at it too long made it feel too close, too immediate. And I turned back toward the door again, my movements more deliberate now, more controlled, and I noticed that Victor's attention shifted slightly as I moved, not intrusive, not following me with his eyes in a way that felt invasive, but aware, present, like he was tracking the environment without making it about me. And that detail, small as it was, told me something about how he operated, about how Dominic's world functioned, and I filed that away without meaning to, because understanding these patterns felt important, felt like something I would need if I was going to navigate this without losing myself in it. And I leaned lightly against the doorframe, my shoulder resting against it as I looked out into the hallway, letting the quiet settle around me. Again, and for the first time since I had come home, I allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding, not out loud, not to Dominic, not to Victor, but to myself. What if this does not end tomorrow? And the answer came too quickly, too clearly. It will not. And that certainty did not come from fear. It came from everything I had seen tonight, from the way Dominic had spoken, from the way Victor stood outside my door, from the way the message had been delivered with such precision, and I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that settle into me, not crushing, not overwhelming, but present, real, and I realized that this was not about getting through the night anymore. It was about what came after, about how I would live with this, with whatever this was becoming, and I shifted my grip on the phone again, bringing it back to my ear. What happens next? I asked, and the question felt different this time. Not panicked, not reactive, but intentional, like I was choosing to step forward instead of being pulled. And there was a pause before Dominic answered, longer than before, like he understood the weight of what I was asking, like he knew this was not just about information, it was about direction. And when he spoke, his voice was as steady as ever, but there was something else there now, something that felt almost like respect. Next, we make sure you are not alone in this again, he said, and the words settled into me in a way that shifted something deeper than anything else he had said tonight, because it was not just about protection, it was about presence, about continuity, about something that extended beyond this moment. And I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle, letting the meaning of it expand into something I could not fully define yet. And when I opened them again, the apartment looked the same, the hallway looked the same, nothing had physically changed, but everything felt different, like the lines of my life had been redrawn in ways I was only beginning to see. And I looked out at Victor again, at the steady presence just beyond my door, and then down at the envelope on the counter, and then finally back at the phone in my hand, and I understood something. With a clarity that surprised me, that this was not something I could walk away from, not without consequences I could not predict, and that meant I had a choice to make, not about whether this would continue, but about how I would face it. And standing there, with the door still open just enough and the night stretching out beyond it, I made that choice in the quietest way possible, by not closing the door, by not stepping back, by staying exactly where I was, and letting whatever came next find me ready. The door stayed open, and that choice lingered in the air longer than I expected, like the room itself had noticed it, like something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and I stood there with my hand still resting lightly against the frame, feeling the quiet settle into something new, not empty, not tense, but aware. And I realized that awareness was not just outside of me anymore. It was inside me too, shaping how I moved, how I thought, how I measured every second that followed. And I turned slightly, looking back into the apartment, at the counter, at the envelope, at the small space that had always felt like enough until tonight. And for the first time I saw it differently, not as a place to hide, but as a place that had already been found. And that realization did not bring panic the way it might have before. It brought clarity, a quiet understanding that whatever safety I thought I had here had already changed, and I lifted the phone again, bringing it closer to my ear, not because I needed reassurance, but because I needed to keep moving forward. If this continues, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, then I need to know what I am stepping into. And there was a pause on the other end, not hesitation, but recognition, like he understood that this was a different kind of question, one that came from choice rather than fear. And when Dominic spoke, his tone carried something new, something that felt less like instruction and more like acknowledgement. You are stepping into something that does not leave easily, he said, and the honesty of it settled into me without resistance, because I had already felt that, already understood it in pieces, and hearing it confirmed only made it clearer, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, grounding myself in the reality of what I was accepting. And I shifted my weight again, leaning more fully into the doorway now, my presence no longer hesitant, no longer caught between staying and retreating. And I glanced at Victor, still steady, still present. And for a moment, I wondered what it was like to live in a world where everything was this controlled, this deliberate, where uncertainty was managed instead of endured. And that thought stayed with me as I spoke again. Then I do not want to be the last one to know things, I said, And this time there was no pause, no delay, just a simple, direct response. You will not be. And something in the certainty of that answer settled deeper than I expected, because it was not just a promise, it was a shift, a change in how I existed within this. And I felt that change take hold, small but real, and I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing just slightly as the tension in my chest eased, not disappearing, but redistributing into something I could carry. And I looked back into the apartment one more time, at the envelope, at the life that had been simple before tonight, and I realized that simplicity had been fragile all along, just waiting for something to disrupt it, and that disruption had come, quietly, precisely, without warning. And now I had to decide what to build in its place, and I stepped fully into the doorway now, not crossing it, but no longer holding back, my stance more balanced, more intentional, and I noticed the way Victor's attention adjusted slightly, not reacting, not intruding, just aligning with the shift in my position, and that detail reinforced everything I was starting to understand about how this worked, about how presence did not have to mean pressure, and I spoke again, this time to both of them in a way that felt natural, even though the connection between us was anything but simple. If something like that message comes again, I said, my eyes moving briefly to the envelope, then back to the hallway. I want to know immediately what it means, not just that it exists. And there was a quiet moment after that, a space, where the weight of what I was asking settled in, and then Dominic responded, his voice steady, grounded, you will. And that was enough, not because it solved everything, but because it established something I had not had before, a line of communication that did not leave me guessing, that did not leave me reacting blindly, and I held on to that, onto the structure it created, and I realized that this was how I would navigate this, not by trying to control everything, but by understanding enough to move with it. And that thought brought a strange kind of calm, one that did not erase the uncertainty, but made it manageable. And I shifted my focus again, back to the present, back to the immediate moment, and I looked at Victor once more, studying him more carefully now, not just as a presence, but as a part of something larger, something I was beginning to engage with, and I spoke quietly, but clearly, if anything changes out here, you tell me first. And he nodded once, the same controlled movement as before. You have my word, he said, and the simplicity of that response carried weight, not because of the words themselves, but because of the consistency behind them, and I accepted it with a small nod of my own, feeling the exchange settle into something mutual, something understood, and I leaned back slightly, resting my shoulder against the frame again, my body finally finding a position that did not feel temporary. And I realized that this was the moment where everything had shifted, not in a dramatic way, not in something visible, but in something internal, something that changed how I stood, how I spoke, how I saw what was happening around me. And as the night continued outside, quieter now, the rain fading completely, the air still and clear, I understood that I was no longer waiting for something to happen. I was part of it now, and whatever came next, I would meet it not as someone caught off guard, but as someone who had already decided to stay, standing when it arrived. The night stretched on without breaking, and that was what made it feel different, not the silence itself, but the way nothing interrupted it. No sudden movement, no raised voices, no sharp shift in the air that told me something was about to go wrong. Just a steady continuation of everything I had already stepped into, and I realized that this waiting without panic, this presence without pressure, was something I had never experienced before, and it made every second feel sharper, more defined, like I was finally paying attention to things I had learned to ignore, and I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against the doorframe, my eyes moving between the hallway and the inside of my apartment, grounding myself in both spaces at once, because neither one felt completely separate anymore, and my phone remained in my hand, the connection still open, the quiet on the other end not empty, but intentional, like Dominic was still there even when he was not speaking, and that alone changed how the silence felt, made it less isolating, less uncertain, and I let out a slow breath, realizing that I was not bracing anymore, not waiting for something to hit, but observing, processing, deciding, and that shift settled deeper than anything else that had happened tonight, because it was not external, it was internal, and I felt it take hold as I straightened slightly, adjusting my stance in the doorway, not defensive, not retreating, just present, and I spoke again, not because I needed an answer, but because I needed to keep defining this new space I was standing in. If they wanted to scare me, they already did, I said, my voice steady. And there was a brief pause before Dominic responded. That was not the point. And I frowned slightly, because that answer did not fit what I expected. And he continued, his tone measured, deliberate. The point was to see if you would react. And something in that clicked immediately. Something that shifted the meaning of the message from warning to test, and I felt my chest tighten again, not from fear, but from understanding, because that meant someone was watching not just what I did, but how I responded. And that realization changed everything, because it meant this was not passive, it was active, it was ongoing, and I pushed myself off the doorframe, pacing once across the small space, my mind moving faster now, connecting pieces that had not made sense before. And what does my reaction tell them? I asked, turning back toward the door, and there was no hesitation in his answer this time. That you are not as easy to ignore as they thought. And the words settled into me in a way that felt both heavy and sharp, because I had spent so long trying to be exactly that, easy to ignore, easy to overlook. And now suddenly that was no longer an option, and I glanced at the envelope again, at the careful handwriting, at the precision of it, and I realized that it had not been careless, not rushed, it had been calculated, designed to draw a specific response, and I felt something shift again. Something more focused, more intentional, because if this was a test, then I needed to understand what passing it meant, what failing it meant, and more importantly, what came next, and I stopped pacing, returning to the doorway, my movements more controlled now, my thoughts aligning into something clearer, and I looked at Victor, still steady, still present, and I realized that his presence was part of the response, part of what was being seen, and I spoke again, this time more certain, then. They are watching right now, and Dominic did not correct me, did not soften it, he simply said, yes, and the simplicity of that answer settled into the space around me, making everything sharper, more defined, and I felt my awareness expand, not in panic, but in focus, taking in the hallway, the positioning, the angles, the way the light hit the floor, the way the shadows moved slightly as someone passed on another level. And I realized that I was no longer just in the moment, I was analyzing it, understanding it, and that shift gave me something I had not expected, a sense of control within uncertainty. And I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing just enough to release the tension without losing the awareness, and I spoke again, quieter this time, but no less certain. Then I am not going to react the way they expect. And there was a brief pause, and then Dominic's voice came through, lower, almost approving. Good. And that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it confirmed that I was not just being guided, I was being understood, and that mattered in a way I had not anticipated. And I held on to that as I shifted my stance again, no longer leaning, no longer bracing, just standing, balanced. And I looked at Victor once more, meeting his gaze directly this time, not as someone uncertain, but as someone who had made a decision, and he held that gaze without hesitation, without challenge, just acknowledgement, and I nodded once, a small, controlled movement that felt like a signal more than a reaction, and I realized that this was how I would move forward, not by withdrawing, not by hiding, but by choosing how I responded, by controlling what I could even when everything else was uncertain. And I turned slightly back into the apartment, my eyes landing on the envelope one last time. And instead of leaving it there, instead of letting it sit as something passive, I picked it up again, folding it carefully, deliberately, and placing it in the drawer beside the counter, not hiding it, not discarding it, but containing it, making it part of something I controlled instead of something that controlled me. And I closed the drawer slowly, the soft click grounding in a way that surprised me. And when I turned back toward the doorway, everything felt different again, not safer, not simpler, but clearer, like the lines of what I was facing had sharpened just enough for me to see where I stood, and I lifted the phone slightly, bringing it closer to my ear. I am still here, I said again, but this time it did not feel like a confirmation. It felt like a statement, like a decision, and on the other end, Dominic did not hesitate, did not question, he simply responded, I know. And that was enough, because standing there, with the door still open and the night still quiet, I understood that whatever this was, whatever had started, I was no longer standing at the edge of it. I was already inside, and for the first time, I was not trying to step back. Morning did not rush in. It arrived slowly, like the night had decided to release its hold 1 inch at a time, and I realized I had not slept at all. Not really, just stood there between the doorway and the room, between what I knew and what I was still learning. And when the first pale light filtered through the window, it did not feel like relief. It felt like confirmation, like everything that had happened had been real, had not disappeared with the dark, and I shifted slightly, my body stiff from holding the same position for too long, but my mind sharper than it had been hours ago, clearer, more focused, and I glanced toward the hallway, toward Victor, who had not left, who had not changed position in any noticeable way, and that steadiness, that consistency, grounded me in a way I had not expected when this began, and I lifted the phone again, still in my hand, still connected in a way that felt less like a call and more like a line that had not been broken, and I spoke quietly. "It is morning." And there was a brief pause before Dominic responded, his voice just as steady as it had been through the night. "Yes." And that single word carried a shift with it. Not an ending, not a resolution, just a continuation, and I let out a slow breath, turning slightly, taking in the apartment again, the counter, the drawer where the envelope now rested, the small details that had once defined my world and now felt like part of something larger, and I realized that nothing had been taken from me, not yet, but something had been added, something that changed how everything else fit together, and I stepped away from the door for the first time in hours, just one step, testing the space, testing the feeling of not holding that line directly, and nothing collapsed, nothing shifted suddenly. The hallway remained quiet. Victor remained where he was, and I felt something settle in my chest, something close to balance, and I spoke again, more certain this time. "I have to go to work," and it sounded almost normal, almost like the kind of statement that belonged to the life I had before, but I knew it was different now, because going back would not mean the same thing it had yesterday. And there was a pause before Dominic answered, longer than usual, like he was considering not just the words but everything behind them. And when he spoke, his tone carried something new, something that felt like agreement rather than instruction. "Then you go, but not alone." And I nodded slowly, because I had expected that, had already understood that this would not return to what it was, not completely, and I glanced at Victor again, meeting his gaze directly, and there was no question there, no uncertainty, just readiness, and I realized that this was what it meant now, not isolation, not independence in the way I had defined it before, but something more structured, more deliberate, and I moved further into the apartment, my steps steady, my movements no longer hesitant, and I walked to the counter, opening the drawer again, taking out the envelope, holding it for a moment as I looked at it one last time, and I did not feel the same reaction as before. Not the sharp edge of fear, not the uncertainty, just awareness, and I folded it once more, placing it carefully into my bag instead of leaving it behind, because it was part of this now, part of what I needed to carry forward, and I closed the drawer, turning back toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the man who had not left his post, and I stepped closer again, stopping just inside the threshold, and I spoke clearly, not questioning, not asking. "We leave in 10 minutes, and Victor nodded once, immediate, precise, and that exchange, simple as it was, felt like something more than coordination. It felt like alignment, like I was no longer reacting to what was happening but participating in it. And I lifted the phone again, bringing it closer to my ear. "I am going back," I said, and there was no hesitation in his response. "I know." And I realized then that this was not something he was watching from a distance, not something detached. It was something he was already part of, something that had already connected us in a way I could not undo. And I stood there for a moment longer, taking in the quiet, the early light, the shift from night to day that had not erased anything, but had made it clearer, sharper, more defined. And I understood something in that moment that settled deeper than anything else, that this was not about being saved, not about being pulled out of something. It was about being seen, fully, clearly, and having to decide what to do with that. And I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, grounding myself in the physical movement, in the reality of what came next, and I stepped closer to the door, not hesitating, not holding back, and for the first time since this all began, I crossed the threshold, stepping into the hallway fully, standing beside Victor instead of behind the line I had drawn for myself. And the air felt different out here, not because it had changed, but because I had, and I glanced once down the hall, then back toward my apartment, and I did not feel the pull to retreat, not anymore. And I spoke one last time into the phone, my voice steady, certain. I am not invisible anymore. And there was a brief pause, just long enough for the weight of that to settle, and then Dominic answered, his tone low, unwavering. No, you are not. And as I stood there in the quiet hallway, with the morning light filtering in and the night still echoing in everything that had not changed, I realized that was the truth I would carry forward, not as something to fear, but as something to understand, because being seen had already changed everything. And there was no going back to who I was before that moment.